In the last video, we talked about competitive markets, competitive market equilibrium, and overall efficiency. The question we start off with here is, will competitive markets achieve the optimal, or the right, amount of environmental protection? And recall the important assumptions of the competitive market, right? There are many buyers and sellers. They're buying and selling largely homogeneous goods or services, which mean homogeneous meaning identical, that property rights are enforced, so ownership rights can be enforced. There are no or very few barriers to entry and or exit, so firms can easily enter or exit the marketplace. And importantly here, with double asterisks and boldface font, that there are no externalities. And what we want to discuss in this lesson is this idea of externalities, what they are, some examples of externalities, and we'll move quickly into what happens to competitive market efficiency if we violate this assumption and we have what's called a market failure due to externalities. The definition of an externality that we'll use is the following. An externality exists when the consumption or production choices of one person or firm enters the utility or production function of another entity without that entity's permission or compensation. You could think of that, the other entity, as an innocent bystander, let's say. If we're talking about externalities that we consider bad, or we'll say negative externalities, you could think of the case or cases where people or firms are generating, let's say, pollution as a byproduct of their production process. And then there are other people or societies that are recipients, or they incur the damages from that pollution, and they're not, granting permission to do that. They're not being compensated from that. And so we'll have this kind of idea of a negative externality. You could also have positive externalities, right? You could imagine an apartment complex where one unit is baking, apple pies, and everyone kind of likes the smell, and everyone enjoys kind of the smell of the baking, but they don't have to pay any of the costs or incur any of the costs to do the actual baking or the activity. And so that's another case where there's an innocent bystander. The bystander is benefiting from it, but it's still not part of the decision-making process. That's our definition of the externality. First example is a non-environmental example, but one that has been kind of on my mind. It's about pickleball, which I've never played pickleball, but is the fastest growing sport in the United States. And here in Boone, North Carolina, in the kind of public rec center, there are many courts and they're always busy. And I think it's a good thing in the sense that it attracts people that are a little bit later on in life. I think 50 plus is the target demographic, that plenty of young people play it, and it's good for people's health and gets them active and all these kind of things. But there is a negative externality, and I guess the noise from the rackets, the plastic balls, the fact that you can have many courts condensed in an area is causing a lot of problems in communities. And so you have this kind of unintended consequence, or those agents, those innocent bystanders, I guess, that are suffering the noise externalities here. The next example is pollution. This is an example or an image of air pollution. Could be caused by the manufacturing of products, could be caused by the generation of electricity. And pollution is going to be an environmental or negative externality that looms large in this class. Most of the policies and regulations we consider have to do with mitigating pollution, whether air or water. Kind of the biggest example, or the most prominent example, is greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change and all those damages that result from climate change. And those are the externalities in this example, right? We don't intend to cause those damages while we drive our cars, fill up our tanks with gasoline, or purchase products that the manufacturing of those products releases pollution or pollutants, but those are those kind of unintended consequences. Here's an image of kind of clear-cutting forested land, which may bring private benefits to an area, to an industry, to a society that can engage in agriculture or development, all the things that we've done in the West for so long, but they come with externalities, negative externalities that we rely on standing forests for all kinds of things. They sequester carbon, for one example, but we rely on the biological diversity that is inherent in these old growth or standing forests for all kinds of medicinal reasons, for crop breeding, and so many other examples. And so we have a negative externality that is the result of clear-cutting forested lands. It's a more specific example of the Atlantic cod that used to be a thriving commercial fishery. And then in the 1990s, because of overfishing, well, at least in part, a heavy part, because of overfishing, stocks declined almost to complete failure. It hasn't. It's recovered somewhat in more recently, but it has failed to recover to what it once was, and that is the result of overfishing, where it may be in the private interest of a vessel or a fisherman to fish as much as possible, but on a social level, that imposes externalities on everyone else. This is an example of a positive externality, beekeeping, right? It brings private benefits to the keeper in terms of maybe it's a hobby that they like or a profession that they're involved in, and through the generation of honey and other products, that there's kind of a commercial interest and there's private benefits. But it also brings public benefits, or what we call positive externalities. Let's write that up here. Positive externalities. And that's because bees help pollinate kind of surrounding areas, whether those are orchards or other agricultural lands, that beekeeping is kind of essential, actually, to that productivity. And so maybe the beekeeper doesn't have this in mind. They're likely not compensated for it, but they are generating a positive externality. Now, the problem with competitive markets is that these external costs or benefits, and for the most part in this class we're talking about negative externalities like pollution, environmental degradation, that these costs are not internalized. They're not part of the decision-making process of consumers when they're driving their cars, or firms when they're generating cement or whatever, maybe generating pollution as well. That is not part of their profit maximizing equation or their utility maximizing equation. And so when we say internalizing, that's what that term means. It means let's factor that in. And if you did factor that in, right, factor in those external costs or benefits, then the optimal decision will change. And in this class, we're thinking about policy, right? We're thinking on a social level, not just on an individual level, that if society is going to take all of these costs and benefits into account, if they're going to internalize them, what would the optimal decision be? And one example that we can kind of think about throughout this class is the social cost of carbon. So carbon, again, is a greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, and which is contributing to climate change or global warming, and all of those costs that are imposed on society, and this is global society, this is a global pollutant, economists try to monetize, and you can see in this image on the right-hand side that dollar sign. And what that monetization is trying to do, right, through the social cost of carbon, which currently is $51. Very soon, I think it's going to be revised to be almost triple that. But that is the estimate that economists have come up with of an additional or the marginal metric ton of carbon released in the atmosphere. That's the cost, that's that external damage, right? The monetary value of the externality from carbon dioxide, another unit, in this case, a metric ton of carbon dioxide. And so internalizing it means that if we set up policies, if we set up regulations, either globally or domestically, that are trying to regulate pollution, then we can use these value, this social cost of carbon, as a way to balance, right, those trade-offs between what the benefit of reducing carbon is, this $51, and compare that to the cost of reducing carbon, which whatever that opportunity cost is, right? It's going to maybe cost more for firms to use alternative sources that generate less pollution.